This is a Best in Climate episode of Earth Feels, where each week your hosts Rose and Christine read to you from some of the best climate-related blogs and articles on the web. Welcome to Earth Feels Best in Climate episode number 77. I'm Christine, your host for this episode. I recently saw a Facebook meme that quipped if 2020 was summed up as a drink, it would be a large glass of colonoscopy prep. Yep. A real cleaning out of bowels this year has been. And you know what? If one's bowels don't get cleaned out regularly, they won't be healthy. Our society was way overdue for an extensive enema. I've been struggling to find an article that links all of the extraordinary events going on in the world, particularly in the US these days, with climate change. Rose has recently, rightfully so, reminded me that this podcast is about climate change, so the article I was interested in reading about the descent into martial law that is happening in the US right now under Donald Trump doesn't qualify for a Best in Climate episode. Because I couldn't find an article that was quite the right fit, this week I've decided to write my own. It's entitled, Something Sacred This Way Comes, and it is posted on tappingcourage.com. So let's get started. It is the height of a beautiful Northern Ontario summer. Wild blueberries are ready to be picked. Our garden zucchini plants are already producing more than we can eat. The heat of the long July days means that, more often than not, you'll find our family down at our dock cooling off with a jump in the lake. Sounds idyllic, right? Much of the time it is, especially when I remember to take a page out of Eckhart Tolle's Be Here Now philosophy. In his book, Practicing the Power of Now, Tolle writes, "The moment that judgment stops through acceptance of what is, you are free of the mind. You have made room for love, for joy, for peace." I don't disagree with Mr. Tolle yet. There are so many earth-shattering, culture-shaking things happening right now. I don't believe Tolle endorses perpetually keeping one's head in the sand. Denial is not a spiritual practice. In fact, anything that is fear-based is not a spiritual, or consciousness-expanding, if you prefer that wording, practice. I'm working on releasing judgment and fear, as Tolle suggests. I'm not, however, ready to ignore the seismic shifts going on all around the world, but in particular in the US. These shifts, I believe, are essential to us collectively addressing climate change as the urgent emergency that it is. The racism, misogyny, and inequality that are being called out are an inextricable part of the current Western cultural paradigm, or way of viewing the world, that dominates the globe right now. This same paradigm is founded on disregard and disconnection from the earth that sustains life. Hence, the environmental degradation we see evidence of in the climate crisis and the sixth mass extinction to which we seem unable to muster adequate responses. What headline-grabbing news is encouraging me to think that a paradigm shift is underway? I'll share 4 reasons. There are more, but I'll share 4. Reason number 1, global capitalism is now on a death spiral. The climate crisis has its roots in the economic and social exploitation of unfettered capitalism. We are 5 months into the global COVID-19 pandemic that has shut down huge sectors of national economies. We are likely on the precipice of a massive economic recession. While the very real pain people are feeling is not to be celebrated at all, the fact is that this COVID-19 related economic crisis may be the only thing that could possibly shift the current runaway unsustainable global economy. The economic pain we will feel with runaway climate change in a decade if we don't take decisive action now will be a great deal more than what we're experiencing now. Economic inequality, which is built into unfettered capitalism, takes a terrible toll on the quality of people's lives. This kind of capitalism is how we've gotten ourselves into the state of climate emergency. We know, for example, that there are 100 companies that are responsible for 71% of the global greenhouse gas emissions since 1998. A new Green Deal that provides equitable employment for people in the clean energy economy and also in mitigating climate change impacts will not happen without a whole lot of external pressure, which this current situation just might be the turning point. If it is implemented, however, it is a way out of this toxic economy that has gotten us into the mess we're currently in. Reason number 2. Inequality is now being exposed for the threat that it is to a country's economy and its citizens' health. It's time to recognize that the climate crisis has its roots in the economic and social exploitation that characterize our current economic system. Unfettered capitalism only works well for the top 1%. The coronavirus pandemic has exposed the huge inequality in healthcare access in the American for-profit healthcare system. The U.S. now leads the world not only in terms of coronavirus deaths, but also in total number of confirmed cases. It turns out American capitalism is not only incapable of addressing the climate emergency, it's also really bad for public health. Reason number 3, racism is now being unmasked. Without racial justice, there is no climate justice. The climate crisis has its roots in the unfettered capitalism that currently runs our global economic system. Without real democracy and violent, militarized troops deployed on peaceful civilians is the opposite of democracy. There is no climate justice or climate action. Black Lives Matter protests continue in major U.S. cities and are now being met with heavily armed federal troops who are uninvited and unwelcomed by city and state authorities. Mums in bicycle helmets, dads with leaf blowers, and now military vets are showing up to form a protective wall between the protesters and the federal troops, who are employing tear gas and shooting impact munitions at peaceful protesters. Let me repeat that. Militarized federal troops are shooting indiscriminately into crowds of ordinary people in America. As professor of history and peaceful Portland protester Maureen Healy said in a Facebook post written while recovering from tear gas and a rubber bullet to her head, I wanted to and will continue to exercise my First Amendment right to speak. Federal troops have been sent to my city to extinguish these peaceful protests. I was not damaging federal property. I was in a crowd with at least 1,000 other ordinary people. I was standing in a public space. We must take this back to Black Lives Matter. Police brutality against Black people is the real subject of these peaceful protests that have been happening in my city and across the country. What happened to me is nothing. It is nothing compared to what happens to Black citizens at the hands of law enforcement, mostly local police, every day. As Mary Annaïse Hegler has written, a world in which we have solved for climate, but leave intact the racist and exploitative systems that created the crisis, is not, in fact, a world in which we have solved for climate. Reason number 4, misogyny is being named and shamed. Without equality for women in our society, there can be no climate justice. The climate crisis has its roots in the patriarchal system of unrestrained capitalism built on a foundation of economic and social exploitation. To address the climate emergency, patriarchy must go. Last week, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC, as she is known, gave a brilliant response to a nasty, misogynistic attack from Republican Congressman Ted Yoho, where he called her, among other things, two words I can't actually say on this podcast because they're so crude, but it rhymes with duck and ditch. AOC's measured and articulate response on the floor of the House is worth watching in its entirety, and I have a link. But her statement linking Yoho's actions against her to the culture of abuse against women that permeates Western culture is worth repeating. What I am here to say is that this harm Mr. Yoho tried to levy against me was not just an incident directed at me. But when you do it to any woman, what Mr. Yoho did was give permission to other men to do that to his daughters. In using that language in front of the press, he gave permission to use that language against his wife, his daughters, women in his community. And I am here to stand up to say that is not acceptable. Thank you, AOC. Quantum thinking is required in these times. Quantum physics tells us the solid, in air quotes, matter that we are and are surrounded by is not solid at all, but rather is, at its most basic level, constantly vibrating energy. Everything that exists is, in its essence, energy. You and I think we're solid objects, but quantum mechanics has confirmed that at the subatomic level, the particles you and I are made of are blinking in and out of this reality. Another astounding finding of quantum physics is the interaction between the observed and the observer. The observer effect is the theory, which has yet to be proven inaccurate, that even passive observation of quantum phenomena changes the measured result. So let's let that sink in. We're not solid matter. We're vibrating energy, and consciousness has an impact. Our consciousness has an impact on reality. The energy healing that I do every day in my wellness practice is based on this quantum reality. Quantum theory hasn't quite made it into mainstream consciousness yet, despite the fact that it's been around for over 100 years. This is probably because it suggests some very strange conclusions about the physical world, which are in stark contrast to the mechanistic worldview of Newtonian physics that we were taught in school, and which still forms the foundation of most sciences outside of physics. If we take seriously what quantum theory suggests about the interaction between consciousness and more solid reality, again, solid in air quotes, that brings us back to Eckhart Tolle's approach to life. What if we do as he suggests and stop viewing the situation outside of ourselves as threatening? What if we stop viewing others who disagree with us as just plain wrong and possibly bad? What if we decide to release attachment, even just a little bit, to what we judge as bad or unacceptable? What if we radically decided to forgive everyone for everything, a life philosophy suggested by my mentor, Dr. Barbara Stone? If quantum theory is accurate, it tells us there is much more to reality than what we can sense through our 5 senses. The mystery that quantum theory suggests, if fully embraced, can open the door to living life fully and joyfully, even in the midst of a global pandemic, an economic recession, a climate emergency. Native American elder, author, and retired Episcopal Bishop of Alaska, Stephen Charleston, wrote recently, "Something sacred is coming this way." That is how my ancestors would have said it. In the midst of all this turmoil and confusion, when we cannot clearly see the path before us, when we feel trapped in a situation we cannot control, then I believe the wise elders of my holy heritage would climb to the high place of the heart, draw the circle of reason and faith around them, and stand to sing their prayers into the open sky of the history to come. They would not shrink into a corner afraid, but rise up to catch the first light of what was coming into being all around them. We are living in a time of emergence. We are witnesses to a great renewal. The world is full of the fear of birth and change, but that transformation will one day be our blessing. Do not be afraid, but be believing. Come to the place where the ancestors are already standing. Come and see. Something sacred is coming this way. This is Christine signing off for this Best in Climate, wishing you a summer filled with golden, sacred moments and the gift of practicing presence. And always plentiful blueberries and zucchini.
That's this week's episode of Earth Feels. Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me.